Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Trade Policy Research Forum webinar for April 2024. While people are coming into the room, let me just say a few words about the forum itself before we get to an introduction of today's session. My co-founder, Hannah Norberg, who's also here, and I founded the Trade Policy Research Forum in 2020 with the aim of bringing something like a lunchtime seminar to as wide a range of people as possible. With the only difference is that we remain friendly and supportive and interested in everything that's going on. So what we try to do is to replicate the atmosphere of a research seminar. We have someone present a paper typically, and then we have a discussant provide comments. We also do sessions on careers and professional development. We've looked at issues like gravity modeling, like getting started in a trade policy career, research subjects for trade, all these sorts of things. And as you can tell from our logo, a big part of what we do is to try and build bridges. So on the one hand, we build bridges between research and practice, because the groups that we're trying to include in the sessions are not just researchers, but also practitioners, policy professionals, and everyone involved in the trade policy space. Then we're also trying to build bridges between the different parts of the trade policy community, that is to say economists, lawyers, policy professionals, public policy specialists, and development studies practitioners. Then the final bridge that we're trying to build is between the centres in the world where trade policy research and practice primarily take place, places like Geneva, Washington, DC, Brussels, and much of our audience who are in low and middle income countries. So what we would like to do is to take advantage of the technology that we have to bring top quality research from wherever it is produced into contact with an audience that is as broad as possible. So today we're going to be talking about trade and environmental outcomes of environment-related technical measures. We have a presentation by Emilia Lamonaca and discussant comments by Amrita Saha. It's a follow-up to a seminar that we did a few months ago with Fabio Santarano, where he was looking more on the trade side of things. Emilia will explain to you how what she's presenting is complementary to that and builds upon it. But without any further ado, I see that we've got a lot of people in the room. So thank you to everyone for attending today. And let me hand over to my partner in crime, Hannah Norberg, to introduce the speakers.
Thank you so much for that, Ben. I see that my connection is a little swayy, but so just jump on in if I fall out. Welcome, 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 everybody. As you can see, the chat box is already going. What I love to do is when people start filling in where they're coming in from today. And there's some really good friends of mine here. Jeffrey's here and Ari's here and a lot of different people. So just get right in there where you're coming in from, because that will warm you up to the chat box so that you can put your questions and comments in there. Because one thing that is always, 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 always true, Beth, is what? We always run out of time. So don't be shy, don't hold back. Go ahead and do that. So we are just thrilled to have Emilia and Amrita here today. They're both research fellows. Emilia at the University of Foggia. Is that how you say it? In Italy? Foggia. Foggia with hands, right?
Foggia.
Foggia. Foggia, obviously. Yes. And Amrita, she is at the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex, and she's actually back for more. So if you really love her performance here today, you can check her out because she was here with Hildegard Nordos last summer. And so without further ado, I'm not going to take up any more time. Go ahead, ladies. We're going to give it to Emilia first. Oh, and also before we start, so nobody panics, presentations will be posted on the website. So you can just kick back and relax and take notes on the things that you want to do. And also join us in the LinkedIn group where conversations can continue. Without further ado, again, go.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much, Ben and Anna, for this introduction. I'm very happy to be here and to present this paper, this research that I'm conducting in collaboration with Fabio Santeramo. Here we focus on technical measures notified for the protection of the environment. And we are interested in understanding which are not only the implication for trade flows, but also in terms of environmental outcomes that are the target of those policies. Let me share first some background information and a few insights on the motivation behind this research. Despite a slight decrease in the global emissions, in the global greenhouse gas emissions, we see that in 2 decades, the emissions embodied in traded goods has grown substantially. They almost doubled from 4 to 9 billion metric tons of CO2 emissions in 2 decades. The interventions despite the regulatory efforts of countries to reduce the emissions. In fact, interventions to reduce the emissions and to lower the negative impacts of global warming span a range of different regulations, both domestic regulations and interventions that are more cooperative. Some examples include, for instance, the pricing mechanism, such as the carbon tax and the emission trading. Those are generally targeted as the optimal policies to reduce the emissions. But indeed, not many countries adopt them to tax the emissions. In addition, we also have some cooperative trade policies, such as the inclusion of non-economic objectives in trade agreements, non-economic provisions in trade agreements, such as the protection of the environment, and also the development of international standards and of voluntary sustainability standards. Last but not least, there are a greater interest of policymakers for technical measures notified under the WTO agreements on technical barriers to trade. That is the focus of this research. Those policies are more and more adopted for the protection of the environment to green the production process and the the inherent characteristic of products. As we can see, in less than a decade, they grew sevenfold from 156 measures notified in 2010 to more than 1,000 measures notified in 2020. So there is a lot of interest of policymakers to adopt these policies. Those policies are unilateral measures, and so they differ substantially across countries that notify them, because they, in a certain sense, reflect the economic and the climate ambitions of countries. So they are extremely diverse and heterogeneous. Moreover, as we can see from the figure, they are even more adopted on clean sector than on dirty sector, and this confirms the tendency described in Shapiro in its QJ paper some years ago. It suggested the presence of an environmental bias of trade policies, where trade policies, both tariff and non-tariff measures, tend to be adopted more and more on clean sector than on dirty sector. We found exactly the same patterns for the non-tariff measures, the technical TBTs, applied to for the protection of the environment. As all the technical measures, the TBT notified for the protection of the environment are characterized by two characteristics. They applied both to domestic market and to any trading partners of the countries that notify the measures. Moreover, they should avoid any unnecessary obstacles to trade. Starting from this background information and from the characteristics of the TBT, we try to address two research questions. We want to understand which are the effects of environmental technical measures on the domestic market and on trading partners. To address the first research question, we focus on the environmental effects of environmental TBT, because if they are adopted at the domestic level, they try to reduce to improve the environmental outcomes of products complying with those regulations. So first of all, we try to understand the overall effect of environmental TBT on domestic emissions, and then we disentangle these effects by source of emissions, considering that, as suggested by Copeland and co-authors, different types of pollutions tend to be correlated to each other. Then we also explore the sectoral dimension, trying to understand if there are any differences in the effects on domestic emission between sectors, because as we have seen in the previous slides, there are different type of regulation across countries, and the clean sectors tend to be more regulated with respect to the dirty sector, that are also the more upstream in the value chain. As for the second research question, we try to understand which is the effects of those measures on trading partners. And here we look at two outcomes. The trade from countries that face those measures, and the related emissions embodied in this trade, in the traded good. In this case, we consider the overall effects, and then we look again at the sectoral differences, considering that the dirty industries are also the more exposed to trade. Then we decompose also the effects between new partners and incumbent partners, trying to understand which are the impacts on the trading partners, considering that the pollution emission rates of countries tend to be very much heterogeneous across partners. We analyze those dynamics considering a panel of 66 countries and 24 sectors defined at the ISIC level, C level. And we use a simple empirical framework in which we correlate the environmental and trade outcomes with the environmental TBT. To address the first research question, the outcome variable is the domestic emission at the country and sector level. While to address the second research question, we consider two different outcome variables. The total imports of the countries that implement the measure, and the emissions embodied in those imports. When we look at the decomposition of the effects, we consider, we distinguish in the independent variable two components. We try to understand basically which is the impact on the extensive and on the intensive margin. When we speak about the intensive margin of the value, both import values and emissions embodied in imports, we consider which is the value weighted count of current exporters with respect to the partners that export in 2 consecutive years. So the extensive margin, consider which are the effects on the new partners. Then when we move to the intensive margin, we simply try to understand which is the effects on the value of partners that export in 2 consecutive years. So we understand which are the effects on the incumbent partners of the countries that notify the environmental TBT. I have to say a few words on the type of data about the variable of interest, that is the environmental TBT, and the independent variables. We have information at the ISIC level for the imports and for the emissions embodied in imports. While the information for the TBTs in general tend to be aggregated at the IHS 6 level. So we have different type of aggregation. we use some conversion tables to adjust the TBT information to be able to merge them with the information on imports and on embedded emissions. However, here we lost some information. We can lose some information about the environmental TBT that in some cases are specific for certain product and could not be attributed to all the industry that we are considering. So trying to better capture the effect of the environmental TBT, we use different proxy. First of all, which is the more naive indicator, we use a dummy variable that simply indicate whether a country implement a TBT for the protection of the environment in a specific sector. This is the very first, the baseline, just to understand which is the basic effect. Then we introduce a further measure that is more refined, that is the total number of environmental TBT notified by a country for a specific industry, for a specific sector. To be more specific, we also introduce some inventory measures, and in particular, we build a frequency index and a prevalence score. A frequency index here is computed as the share of products defined at the HS6 level that have at least an environmental TBT. And then the prevalence score is defined as the average number of environmental TBT in a specific combination notifying country and sector. We have several control factors, such as the average level of tariffs, ad valorem tariff equivalent. We have some characteristic specific of the country that notify the environmental TBT, such as the GDP per capita and the level of population. And we have also some other control factors collected in some fixed effect. In particular, we have a country sector specific fixed effects that capture all the characteristics of an industry in a specific country. And then we have also fixed effects that are sector time specific, trying to capture the effect of the evolution of technology over time in each industry. Now, moving to the results very quickly, I will show you the effects on the domestic emissions, so to address the first research question. Basically, we found that the environmental TBT are negatively correlated with the domestic emissions, and we found also that the main contributor to this effect is the CO2. But in general, we found a trade reducing effect for all gases that we consider, for all the source of pollution that we consider. On average, the presence of an environmental technical measure contribute to cut the global emissions, the domestic emissions, by 4 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent on average per year. This saved amount could be associated to a value that range between 320 and 360 million euro. This is based on the carbon pricing that we observed in 2023 on the European Union emission trading system, where the carbon pricing had an average of 80 and 90 euro per tons of CO2 equivalent in the last year. When we look at the sectoral effect, we found, not surprisingly, that the reduction effect tend to be correlated with the level of regulations in the sector. In fact, we found a more marked effect, reduction effect, in the sectors that tend to be more regulated, such as the manufacturing sectors. Here there are a lot of open research questions. As mentioned before, the manufacturing sector that is they tend to be more clean with respect to other sectors such as the agricultural sector that are also less regulated than the manufacturing sector. So here we found exactly this pattern that the environmental activity tend to reduce most the emissions produced, the emissions obtained to produce the manufactured goods. And here there is an open question. These sectoral differences, difference are related to the different level of sectoral regulations, but the sectoral regulation tend to be related also to the strategies adopted by countries. So what is the driver of the domestic strategies? They are driven by the level of emissions, so countries aim to reduce the emission associated to the production in the manufacturing sector, or they try to or they regulate the sector that are more strategic for their economies. This is an open question, and we are trying to understand. We are running several analyses trying to understand if these effects are more related to effects related to the environmental protection, or could be considered as a sort of hidden green protectionism. We have not yet much evidence, but we are working on this to trying to understand better these effects. Now, let's move to the effects on trading partners. We have seen that at the domestic level, the environmental TBT plays a good role. They reduce the emissions, but they could have some spillover effects on their trading partners, because partners that would enter the market of the notifying countries should comply with those measures. What we found on average, in general, we found that the effects on trade tend to be null, they are almost zero. And this is not surprising. This is consistent with the literature on non-tariff measures, where at the aggregate level, in general, the effects tend to be equal to zero, because they are could be both trade barriers or trade catalysts, depending on the ability to comply with those measures. And there is a lot of heterogeneity across countries, across the country and sector dimensions. And this is exactly what we found also for the environmental TBT. But when we disaggregate the effects, we decompose the effects between new partners and incumbent partners, we found basically that that we have no effects at the entry. So environmental TBT do not constitute an entry barrier, but neither facilitate the access to the market of the implementing countries. But we found that they have that we obtain less trade from the incumbent partners. So basically, we have a negative effects, a negative correlation between the environmental TBT and the trade of from the incumbent partners. So we can conclude that these unilateral measures tend to create some obstacles to trade that are not in line with the principles of the WTBT agreements that we mentioned earlier starting this presentation. And so we observe some spillover effects on trading partners. But what happens when we consider the trade-embedded emissions? We expect that the negative effects that we observe on trade should be nullified if those trade comes from the less emitting partners, the cleaner partners. But this is not the case. We found exactly the same effects on the trade weighted for emissions. No effects at the entry, but less trade embedded emissions from incumbent partners, and in particular for more regulated sectors. Again, so we could suggest a sort of potential leakage effect where the environmental TBT are non-discriminatory, because they allow trade from any trading partners, so they do not limit the trade from the most emitting partners. Now, let me briefly conclude this presentation with some messages and a lot of open questions for which I hope to have your suggestions to improve this working paper. In particular, we found that environmental TBT cut as expected the domestic emissions and in particular produce a reducing effect for the cleaning sector, and this support the hypothesis of the environmental bias of trade policies mentioned by Shapiro. So here we ask whether why the clean sector are the most regulated. They are the most regulated because they are the most strategic for the domestic market. So here we could suggest a sort of hidden green protectionism of those measures. We also found that the environmental TBT are trade distortive, and this is against the principle of the WTO TBT agreement. The WTO TBT agreement suggests that any technical measure should be not distortive, should not create any unnecessary obstacle to trade. Moreover, we also found that the environmental TBT are not tailored against more polluting countries, so they are not discriminatory, and this is consistent with the principle of the WTO TBT agreements. But however, this could create inefficiency in the main non-economic objective, that is the improvement of the environmental outcomes. So they are ineffective in limiting the trade obtained in countries with dirtier technologies. So there are a lot of problems that need to be investigated there. Maybe these results could be associated to some flaws in the conformity assessment procedure. Maybe there are not too much testing procedure, certification procedure that allow to certify that the production that the product is obtained with a cleaner technology. Moreover, we ask whether those unilateral policies are more industrial policies than environmental related policies. This could be confirmed if those policies are adopted to protect the domestic market rather than to achieve a real improvement in the environmental outcomes. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much for the attention, and I leave the floor to Ben or I don't know.
Thanks, Emilia. That was a great presentation. Just so you know, there's a few questions and comments. Some are in the chat box and some are in the Q&A box. So feel free to have a look at that, and we'll circle back to it during Q&A. But let me hand over to Amrita for her discussant comments. Floor's yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben, and thank you, Emilia, for your presentation. And of course, you had shared a previous version of your results, so that's all been really helpful. Let me just start by saying that I find this really interesting, and this is really important because, of course, speaking as a trade economist who works in the field of development, I couldn't agree more that we need to generate evidence which allows us to think, understand, and act on the links between international trade and the environment. And as you rightly started your presentation by saying that this is a highly debated area. So I think any attempt to generate evidence, disaggregated evidence, and I think needs to be really appreciated. So thank you for this attempt together with your co-author. And I think linked to that, one of your slides, talked about sort of the information, or rather, I don't know, asymmetries of information around how policy interventions might kind of be viewed and applied. So you've rightly highlighted there's a political economy element here. But I think why that is important is something to think about. So based on that, I want to make a couple of suggestions and reflections of what you might do in terms of sort of further steps. I don't want to spend, of course, so much time on saying what all things are really useful, because as I've said, that I think this is really interesting. So I think first, my first comment, or really really looking at your results and hearing your presentation today, my first thought is that I think the fact that you're trying to disaggregate these effects, I think by source and sector, it's something to think further, because as I understood, you're able to disaggregate by sort of the country applying the measure as well as across partners. And so I'm just wondering, and here's maybe playing a little bit of a devil's advocate, or maybe, this may not be possible, and feel free to say that, is that, coming at this from a development lens, I'm always thinking about how can we disentangle better consumption and production, and related to that, production of intermediates that go into final products, right? Because in your attempt, you're trying to see how might there be effects which differ by applying country and across partners. Is it possible that this could be flipped around to say that, in terms of sort of where consumption of those products and production, sort of in terms of both intermediate and final products, is located and linked to use of those TBT measures, as well as their effects by by that sort of lens of consumption and production? Because often we know that emissions are happening, and they're not always sort of at the same geographies as consumption is happening. So my question, and I know I've asked this to Fabio on various occasions, is how do we disentangle this bigger question? It may not be within the scope of what you're doing, but I think you've definitely given us a good grounding and basis to think about how can we disaggregate, on these kind of lenses if we were to do that. My second point is, again, a little bit, I'm sorry that I have my development hat on in a very major way today. My second question is, you had these results by sort of agriculture, manufacturing, and you talked about agro industry and how that might be playing a role. I also wonder, what about, is there anything that you could say in terms of food and nutrition? And what I'm trying to say is that, like production of certain types of food products, which are mainly for sort of direct consumption vis-a-vis production of more agro food. And I'm thinking about products like tea, coffee. So again, I think my interest here is that how can we disentangle on, different dimensions? Maybe consumption and production is one idea, but second could be a nutrition lens, or a more sort of, food security lens. My third set of comments, and this is a little bit more empirical, and I consider them minor, because I know you've got a very good audience who's, I'm sure, sort of really dying to ask questions. My minor empirical questions. The first one is, I think it would be helpful, either, of course, in your paper, I'm sure you'll do it, but for today's audience, maybe if you said a little bit more to unpack the types of technical barriers to trade, and how you do the sort of, how do you say and identify that these are environmental TBTs? And I'm sure, people who work with these measures, it's more obvious to them than others. It might be helpful if you said how you did that in terms of putting this data together, because that data could be quite valuable to others in terms of use and applying for development or political economy questions. My second question is slightly related to the first one, is that I would be quite interested to understand, first, I think the scope, and maybe you've already done it, but maybe you haven't said it because it's more sort of in terms of further steps, is can you say something about also types of technical barriers to trade? Because in your empirical estimates, and you have technical barriers to trade, environmental, and you have technical barriers to trade others. And in terms of the political economy, I was also wondering if there's any sort of interaction there, or maybe there's something to say which, at sort of a country sector level, something like some kind of interactions between the types of TBT measures, which, in your estimation, you of course have the environmental ones and the other ones as well. Maybe I should stop there. I have some other reflections, which I'm sure we can continue chatting about. But for today, I think I'll stop my contribution there and hand over to you, Hannah and Ben, because I see you have a very good audience. So
yeah, thanks so much. So 2 great presentations. Let me hand back to Emilia first. Is there anything that, before we go into the sort of free-form Q&A session, is there anything you'd like to respond to in Amrita's comments? So please take a few minutes to do that.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Arita, for your comments. Amrita, for your comments, very insightful. I have some own answers and other points to be deepened on with you. Let me start from the end. You asked how we disentangle between environmental TBT and other TBT. Basically, we did a lot of content analysis, basically on TBT in general. Let me also respond in this moment to a question from the audience, which is the source of this data. This data comes from the WTO information management system. There we have all the TBT notified from any countries, any WTO members. So we check each notification and distinguish them between the environmental ones and other measures notified for other objectives, such as the protection of human health, protection of plant, animal life, harmonization, and so on and so forth. Those objectives are attributed by the notifying countries. So this distinction is based on the classification made by each country. Each country self-report the objective of their measures. So we can distinguish them according to this. So this is the first analysis that we did. Then we also make other content analysis to understand which is the type of those specific measures notified for the protection of the environment. So we classify them in several groups, considering the classification provided by the MUST group, basically. So we can distinguish if they are labeling or management of toxic substances or conformity assessment procedure, and so on and so forth. So we could disentangle also this dimension, and this will be a further step of this analysis, trying to understanding if there are peculiar effects. In fact, this could be related also to another point that you suggested, Amrita. If we could distinguish between the effects on consumption and production, this could be a previous step, understanding which is the aim of those measures, to understand if they address problems at the consumption level or at the production level. For instance, measures that simply provide requirements for labeling or for packaging may be more related to the consumption side, while other that provide requirements for the production process are more related to the production side. So in this sense, we could distinguish this information. As for the agro-food production you mentioned, I need to stress the fact that this is a global analysis, so we don't have only the agri-food sector, but also other sectors. So we didn't consider only the manufacturing of food, but also manufacturing of other products. I'm not sure we have enough disaggregated data to understand which could be the impacts in terms of food security or in terms of nutrition, because those type of data are aggregated at the industry level. So it is very difficult to deepen on those dimensions. We could do this considering, for instance, more disaggregated data, and this is related mostly to our previous work, where we try to understand which are the trade effects, considering the HS6 digit level. There we could try to do also this analysis. And also interesting the point on the development, we could to understand which are the differences in terms of emissions, for instance, between exporting countries, relate the emission levels to the level of development, and try to understand if there are differences in this sense. This could be a potential drivers in terms of the political economy analysis that we are thinking about, possibly. I don't know if I reply to all questions. I hope yes, but if you have any
we
other,
can get into that in the Q&A.
yeah.
Look, that's great. You know, thanks for getting the discussion started in that way. I mean, I think we have a really nice presentation and some great comments. Plus, we have some great questions in the Q&A. So you've answered, I think, the one about data. So you know, it's the WTO database, there's the classification by countries, and then you've gone through and looked at that in further detail. So that makes sense. I have a question about your first set of results. I mean, they're really sort of two sets of results. There's one on domestic emissions, and there's one on the effect on other countries. Now, the domestic emissions results really interested me, because when we think of TBTs, you know, normally one of the questions we have is, do they discriminate between imports and domestic production or not? You know, do they maintain this kind of national treatment obligation? Is it an implication of your findings that the measures that you're looking at indeed tend to do that? I'm asking the question because if you had a discriminatory measure, so I mean, something like a tariff, which does not apply to domestic production, but does apply to foreign production, is actually going to shift dirty production from overseas locations to your home location in a relative sense. So there was a question about CBAM. I mean, in the modelling on CBAM, that's something that you see, that industries move from one place to another, not to any great degree, but that movement happens. But we don't see that in your data. So are we actually capturing TBTs that are really just sort of non-discriminatory domestic regulations on the environment?
I'm not sure that we can assess the non-discriminatory of those measures at the domestic level. In my view, it's more easy to understand if they are non-discriminatory against the trading partner, because if those measures, my personal view is that if those measures are applied at the domestic level, it is more likely that the country that implement the measure has the technical and financial means to comply with those measures. So it is more likely that the producer in the domestic country are able to comply with them. But those measures could provide more problems, let me say in this way, to the partners that would enter the market of the notifying countries. So it is likely that this could be seen as an disincentive for to export to those markets, and in this sense they could be protectionist in the sense. This is my view. It's a sort of hidden protection with respect to other measures that tax explicitly the carbon tax, basically, that you mentioned.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around is the sort of difference in strength between the two sets of results. So the first part of the paper, you have quite strong results on domestic emissions. Then when you go to the spillover effects, it's fairly mixed. I mean, you find some results, but there are a lot that are sort of not significant. I mean, there are some with a sign that is maybe a little unexpected. How do we sort of reconcile that? How do we think about those two things together?
Because they are, in my opinion, they are completely different information, because we are not considering exactly the emission intensity that we that are carried over from the producing country to the importing countries. The variable that we analyze is the trade weighted by emissions. So basically, it's the trade shifted by a scalar that is equal to the emissions. So in this sense, we assume that we could consider that if we don't found any different effect with respect to the trade, we can assume that it is the trade of more polluting countries that is moving. They are the traded goods that are produced with a dirtier technology that is moved from one country to another. And this contrasts with the principle of those measures that are implemented to clean the production process, to improve the environmental performance, not only of the countries that implement them, but also to allow to import products that are cleaner. But we cannot, we don't observe this tendency.
So maybe let me take a step back. I mean, I'm very clear on what you're using as the dependent variables in the first step. So there's domestic emissions of greenhouse gases, then you've broken it down by type of gas. So I get that. I think before we started, you mentioned that that's the OECD data, right? That you're using for that.
Yes, exactly, for the trade embedded emissions.
Yep.
For the domestic emission, we use the data from Climate Watch, basically.
Oh, okay, got it. So in the second stage, is what we're seeing trade values or the emissions embedded in trade?
Emissions embedded in trade.
Okay, so that's what's coming out of that OECD.
Yeah.
So this captures, I think, part of what Amrita was referring to with the, these sort of arguments about production stages, movement of input production, all those sorts of things. So if you're getting, there are lots of different measures in the OECD database, but you can certainly use one that captures, all of the embedded emissions in my consumption of stuff that I'm getting from other places. So that goes right back then through the supply chain, right? That you're getting these kinds of effects.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. It depends on how the measure is built. Exactly. The methodological note of the OECD explicitly mentioned that is the trade weighted by an emission intensity factor.
Yeah.
So they are scattered.
Okay. Let me maybe hand over to Hannah to see if she's got something she wants to put into the mix.
Always, you know it, Ben. Emilia, everything that has to do with quality infrastructure is something that I am totally fascinated about. And so I would personally like to hear more about your thoughts about the conformity assessment, how that loop works. And then I would like to ask the question that I always ask for all the people who are coming in from developing countries, all the brilliant new researchers that are out there and are looking for interesting things. And that is, now that you've put together all this data, A, is it available to others? And B, what are the questions that you think somebody else should be running with? Now that you have done this, what do you think somebody else should be doing next to cross things off the list, or to look deeper into the mystery of things? I'm just going to drop that first.
Okay, thank you so much for your question. Let me start from the conformity assessment procedure. This is a hot topic indeed, because okay, there are a lot of procedures, but they are generally notified as technical measures. In some cases, they are linked with the requirements for the production, for the characteristic of the products. In other cases, they are notified as a separate measures, so they could be notified later with respect to the product requirements. It's not clear to me if the countries where the verification process, in which point we have the verification process, if it is in the source country or if it is in the destination country. I suppose that in some cases there is a mismatch between this this verification procedure, and this could be a sort of large net in which we could observe a movement of products that don't comply with the conformity assessment procedure that are mandatory. But if there is a mismatch between the checkpoint, if there is not a double check, there could be some problems in the verification process. So this could be a point. As for the data, yes, they are all the data used in this analysis are publicly available, and once the paper will be published, the dataset will be open, but all the sources are publicly available, so they are easy to be collected and used for other research. Maybe I missed some other question?
Yeah, the question was then, now that you have it, what is it that you wish, what's the next thing that you wish that somebody ran with, that you've worked on that, but you can't tackle right now, but that you wish that somebody else who's brilliant, who's out there, could run with?
I hope in my opinion, what is missing here is a more disaggregated analysis. So it would be better to have more disaggregated data on emission. This is the big problem in my view, and future research should be focused on understanding how this could be, this lack of information could be managed if there are some other source of data that could be introduced or merged or something like this. I suppose that this could be a good path for future research.
I'm going to add one that occurred to me while both of you were speaking, and I mean, I think it was mentioned at different points, but the political economy of this is also quite interesting. So there's a nice quantitative literature on the political economy of trade policy. At least when I was looking at it, admittedly some time ago, it was nearly all about tariffs. So I know that people have tried to start doing that with different sorts of NTMs. Something that would really interest me is, you know, the effects that you guys are finding in the data. You know, can we explain any of what we see with political economy variables? So I think that would be, I mean, it's a completely different research question, but I think that would be a really fun one to try and do. Emilia, let me ask you a question about data. I know you've had a bunch of questions about data. Now, I'm going to embarrass myself when I ask the question because it's based on work that I was doing literally 20 years ago. So, you know, I should have more grey hair and all that sort of thing. The camera's hiding it a bit. But one of the issues with notification data at the WTO is that it's not really policed. So countries notify the way that they want to. And when I was looking at this, and you know, feel free to tell me that it's gotten much better in the last 20 years, but I was looking at it specifically within the European Union, where you would expect that TBTs, they're not identical from country to country, but they should be reasonably similar because there's a lot of European regulations going into it. And you would find some countries that were very cautious in their notification. So they would just notify everything. We don't want to breach our WTO notifications. So anytime we pass a change to our tax code that might affect traded goods, we're going to notify it. Some countries did that. Other countries said, we don't have the time or the resources, we're not going to notify anything. And in many cases, they were implementing regulations that were relatively similar. So how do we deal with this fact that countries differ in what they notify, how often they notify, and you know, also in classification? Are there still these sorts of issues, or is the data now looking much better than it did when I was playing around with it?
Thanks for this observation. Very extremely timely indeed. You are right. Those type of data are very complex. Indeed, there is a lot of notification from a specific group of countries. When we analyze the countries that tend to notify, we observe similar tendency. In general, the more developed countries are the countries that notify the most technical measures. Then we have also a group, a small group of lower middle income countries that tend also to notify, but they are a sort of club. I'm thinking about, for instance, Uganda and Rwanda, two African countries that are very small, but they notify a lot of TBT for everything. While other countries have very different policy strategy. Another example is, for instance, the European Union. The European Union is not much is not too much environmental measures, indeed. This could be quite strange, but indeed is related to a different policy that regulate the member state of the European Union. In fact, the member state need to notify any technical regulation before internally to the European Commissions. And when the European Commission checked the regulation and found that those regulations could create any problems to the common principle in the European Union, or could create some problems to the other trading partners, in those cases, those measures are notified also to the WTO. So in some cases, there are also other checks, internal checks, as for the example of the European Union. So you are right. Those measures are not uniform across countries, and in particular, the notification, in my view, the notification is highly dependent on the ability of a country to participate in the notification process. If they are, if they have a voice in the WTO arena, so it depends a lot on the power, let me say, in the sense of the country that notifies. In fact, we found that most of the measures are notified by more developed countries. So there is a sort of bias also from the country dimension.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it's a good note to kind of wrap things up on. So, you know, Amrita was talking about you know, some of the development aspects of this, and you know, there are obviously important development aspects depending on how these types of measures shift production and consumption. But there's also the issue of participation in WTO processes, which has been on the agenda as long as there's been a WTO, that some of these processes are quite onerous. It requires a lot of money, a lot of expertise to set up the institutions and the processes where you can notify this stuff. And so the question I always have is, you know, when we see a country that's not notifying very much, does that mean that they have few regulations, or just they're not notifying them? We can have a guess one way or the other. Your example on Rwanda and Uganda is fascinating. So that's something that was very different when I was looking at the data. So this is recent behavior by those two countries. But that's really interesting. And I think it suggests that we can't find an easy answer to that question. For instance, that if I'm not notifying, it just means I don't have any regulations. How we deal with that in an empirical model is a big question mark for me. So obviously there's some measurement error in the variable. There are lots of kinds of measurement error that we don't really need to care about when we run an econometric model. You know, as long as it's uncorrelated with the other variables in the model, you're going to get the right answer. So is that something we can argue in this case? I don't know. Open question. So I'm going to wrap up by summarizing a couple of the things that we got through the discussion. I always like, you know, I like it when Hannah asks people, like, what should others go out and research? And so I think we've had some really nice suggestions of that. Emilia had a couple of suggestions. I think the development angle was coming out in Amrita's comments. And then for my part, I think political economy is really interesting. There were questions in the chat about the UNCTAD database. It would be really interesting to try and replicate this work using the UNCTAD database, because UNCTAD goes out and collects the data. They don't rely on notifications. So it gives you potentially a different picture from what you see in notifications. Difficulty is they use the MAST classification for NTMs. So figuring out what's environmental and what's not is not straightforward. You can maybe use some text searching because they have a little note on what the NTM is about, but that's getting into a whole different. So, I mean, it really is a separate kind of research question. But I think a great research seminar, you can always tell that there are lots of questions at the end. If we walk out and we know the answer to everything, it's that we didn't ask a hard enough question. So I think in this case, we asked a nice hard question. We got some interesting answers, and we got a great set of ideas for how to take the discussion forward. So let me thank you, Emilia, for a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. I got a lot out of it. And I know that's true for everyone in the audience as well. And thank you, Amrita, for some great discussion comments. I think that was a really good example of the kind of constructive discussion that we like to have here. So speaking of discussions that we like to have here, let me do a quick advertisement for our next session, which is coming up next month. We're going to be shifting gears a little. When I opened, I said that we often do a kind of research paper and discussion presentation like this one, but we also like to do professional skills and professional development related webinars. So this is a good one, I think, for people at any stage in their career, but particularly if you're early on. Because something that I know I found really difficult, and I think everyone finds really difficult, is learning how to write and present in a way that people who make policy and make decisions can actually relate to and get things out of. We have two fantastic presenters. We have Bob Koopman, who's former chief economist of the WTO, now at American University, and we have Michael Ferrantino, who's a former lead economist from the World Bank. These guys have been doing it a long time. They're very good at it. And I think there'll be lots of little tips and tricks for people to pick up, in particular in terms of kind of how to make the transition from a graduate school environment to a policy making environment when it comes to writing and presenting. So please do join us for that. It's on May the 16th at the usual time, 9 a.m. Eastern. So with that, thanks, Hannah, as always, for being my partner in crime. Thanks, Emilia, for a great paper and presentation. And thanks, Amrita, for excellent comments. We look forward to seeing everyone in roughly a month's time.
And thank you for everybody in the audience and for all the amazing questions. If you haven't already, jump into our LinkedIn group and also sign up on the website so that you get notified on all the things that are going on here. So good to see everybody, and we'll catch you again next month.
Okay, bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.